Welcome to Spectral Shadows. This is the place where the stories don't just haunt your mind, they follow you into the dark. Before the whispers begin, tell me, where are you watching from and what time is it? Midnight? Or closer to the hour when shadows move on their own? If you're brave enough to continue, prove it. Like this video, subscribe to Spectral Shadows and leave a comment with your time and location, so we'll know exactly where to find you. Now, let's open the door to tonight's nightmare. Story number 1. I used to work the night shift at the hospital. There's a reason they call it the graveyard shift, but that's another story. I don't particularly like the place, but they pay well, so I can't complain too much about being the lucky guy who gets to clean up the operating rooms after an operation. At least I had some company. His name is Joe, and he's not very outgoing. I had to ask one of the other janitors to find out his name. He likes to keep to himself, and I've never heard him talk. He's a big guy, and he has the job of mopping the hallways. He does a good job, but that's mostly because he mops so slowly and methodically that he can't possibly miss a spot. Joe's a bit of an odd bird. He wears surgical gloves and mask, along with a surgical hat and gown. Maybe he's paranoid about germs. The way this hospital is run, who can blame him? Even though he's not very social, it's good to have him around, especially at night, when I'm cleaning up the bloody rags and sometimes pieces of botched surgeries that litter the operating room floors. Every once in a while, Joe could be called upon to take one of the bodies down to the morgue. And yes, the morgue is the creepiest place you could possibly imagine. Trust me, you never want to go to the morgue, especially at night. One of the things I learned early on is you never look at the bodies. Your imagination will take over every time, and you will see something twitch underneath a sheet. That's why I stopped looking. When I have a delivery, I do it and get the hell out. Sounds? Of course, you'll hear sounds. Once again, it's probably your imagination, but every once in a great while, there's a twitch or two, and then there's the person who's not quite dead. But that also is another story. You could say I've seen a lot of things during my time here. Some of the most disconcerting is the bloody handprints on the wall. I've never figured out how they get there, but as per my job, I clean it up, punch out, and go home. Do I ever mention anything to the hospital administration? Nope. I discovered long ago that there are things they just don't want to hear about. So I clean it up, keep my mouth shut, and collect my paycheck. On this particular evening, as I rolled my gurney back out of the morgue, my imagination made me think that I heard a thump, a heavy thump. However, the more sensible side of me completely ignored it and kept on pushing the gurney at a slightly faster speed, maybe. But nonetheless, I ignored it and went about cleaning the next operating room. I became so involved in listening to my music that I never heard the doors of the room open and close again, or the footsteps approaching me, until it was too late. I turned around, and there was a corpse lurching, arms outstretched, mouth open, 3 feet from me. I froze with fear. My mind shut down. This thing didn't seem possible. I was too stunned to defend myself. The horrid stench that emanated from it was nearly enough to finish me off. It approached, teeth bared, inches away from its macabre feast. My mind was paralyzed with fear and utter shock, and then my mind dropped further into denial when Joe burst through the door, lumbered over, grabbed the corpse, twisted its neck until I heard a sickening crunch, then threw it against the wall as if it were a rag doll. The corpse crumpled to the floor as Joe pulled off his mask to reveal a nightmare face of deathly pale skin and sunken cheeks. He seized the corpse and began chewing on its neck. He feasted on the gore of the corpse as he ripped it to pieces. The corpse twitched only twice, and then ceased to struggle as Joe devoured it. A few minutes later, Joe stopped, allowed what was left of the body to fall to the floor, and looked straight at me. I'd never seen that look in his eyes before. They were inhuman, fierce, and unnaturally hungry. He advanced, arms reaching toward me. Finally, I could see Joe's face up close. His skin was pale and rotting away like a corpse. His teeth were yellow and mostly gone. As he advanced, I realized how completely helpless I was. I realized that my rescuer had become my doom, and I would soon share the same fate as the unrecognizable pile of gore that lay beside me. And then he stopped. The glaze lifted from his eyes. He looked at me, pulled his mask back over his face, and lumbered over to the body. He grabbed one leg and drug it out of the room, leaving a trail of blood and body parts. I sat there for a long time, trying to convince myself it was a horrible nightmare. But every time I opened my eyes, the bloody splotch on the wall and the trail of blood were still there. I started mentally updating my resume, eventually finding the strength to get up and shakily walk across the room. When I stepped into the hallway, there was Joe with his back to me, slowly mopping up the trail of blood that led back to the morgue as if it was another boring night. He looked back the hall at me for one moment and then went right back to mopping. Story number 2. For some background, I work on a cancer drug trials unit. We have about 10 different teams, all working as part of different drug trials. This obviously requires a lot of blood samples to be taken. That's where I come in. I take blood samples for all the patients arriving for the clinics in the morning. The general samples get sent up to our main hospital lab, and the more specific trial ones get processed in a smaller lab on our unit. For a while, only one person worked in the small lab, but eventually it became too busy, and I was offered the opportunity to train and work in the lab in the afternoons. I jumped at this chance. It meant I still got to work with patients, which I love, but also learned new skills and got to be more involved with the actual drug trials. This was about 8 months ago, and it has all gone great until today. As I said, I love working with the patients. You would think working with cancer patients would be mostly sad and depressing, but it isn't. They are generally great and usually have very positive outlooks, even when the prognosis isn't particularly good. Most of the patients are up for a chat and joke. Some of us even started a book club where we exchange books and then discuss them the next time they are in. Over the weeks and months of repeat visits, you really get to know them, which is why when something is off, you notice. Today, a family came in. They have been coming twice a week for the last 6 months while the mother is treated. Let's call her Mrs. J. They always come in together. We have chatted lots and get on great. Today, something was off. Mrs. J, who is usually the chattiest of the lot, wasn't saying a word. She was just smiling, silently smiling, an empty smile. A smile in the mouth only, not reflected in the eyes or the rest of the face. A smile that somehow triggered my base animal instincts and sent chills down my spine. Now, I know what you're thinking. Maybe she was just sad and putting on a brave face. But we get a lot of people putting on a brave face. I recognize that look well, and this was not that. The strangest thing about it all, however, was that her family seemed creeped out by her too. Usually her husband stands by her side the whole time, holds her hand as I take her blood, and we all chat away. Their kids, who are around 16 and 19, usually aren't as chatty as the parents, but they still talk and laugh with us. Today, the husband and kids all stood by the door, as far from my phlebotomy chair as possible, while still remaining in the room. At this point, I didn't think too much of it and just wondered if they were having some problems at home or had recently argued or something. It was later that day that things were to get much stranger. Once all the patients for the clinic had been through the blood room, I decided to skip lunch as I wasn't particularly hungry. I do this sometimes as it lets me get a head start on the processing, and I get to leave a little early and miss the traffic. Also, since the other lab tech is at lunch and then meetings, I didn't have to queue for the centrifuge today. I got into the lab and opened up the fridge where the samples are stored. In the harsh light of the fridge, I could now see how dark Mrs. J's blood samples were. Different shades of blood are nothing new. I've seen all colors from bright pink to darkest red, but this was almost jet black. Well, different treatments and conditions can affect the blood in all kinds of ways, I thought to myself. I started with her samples, as she had a large number of vials to process. Now, to process the samples, they have to be spun in a centrifuge to separate the plasma from the blood cells. At least that's the case for most of the samples I deal with, excluding a couple that need cell-free DNA extracted. But for this study, it was just the plasma that was needed. For those who don't know, to make sure the centrifuge runs smoothly, you have to balance the weight of the sample with a similar bottle opposite, or the spinning will literally destroy the machine. Normally you can get close by filling another similar tube with a matching amount of water, then make small changes till the weight matches, but not this time. The blood sample somehow weighed far more than it should, despite it not feeling much different to other samples when I handled it. After checking the scales repeatedly for errors, and it showing itself to be working fine, I had to balance it out with a tube twice the size and full to the brim. I set the centrifuge running and decided to go grab a coffee while it ran its course. In the small coffee shop, as I queued, I saw Mrs. J's family sitting at a table without her. They still looked pale, and, for want of a better description, they looked scared. It's not unusual to see family members looking upset, but this looked like more than that. They were huddled together quietly discussing something. So despite having questions I wanted to ask, I decided not to bother them. I just took my coffee and headed back. I wish now I had spoken to them then. Back in the lab, the centrifuge was almost done, so I prepared the bits and pieces I would need. Once the furious spinning had ceased, I removed the sample and prepared to siphon off the plasma with a pipette. Something was strange about the sample, though. I carefully held the sample up to eye level to catch the light and better see what had happened. The majority of the blood cells were settled at the base, as they should be, although looking even more dark now that they were so concentrated. But even stranger than the color were the thin tendrils of black blood cells stretching up to the surface of the plasma, swaying and twisting slightly, almost like plants in a pond. Now, there are times when a blood sample doesn't separate properly, but you usually just end up with red-tinged plasma in these cases. This was like nothing I had ever seen before, but the plasma around these strange formations looked clean, so I decided to try to draw it up while avoiding these thin, outstretched tubes of cells. On opening the cap, there was a strange smell, something like petrol mixed with old garlic and stagnant water that wafted up to my nose, making me wince. At this point, I was still just thinking that the treatment she was on was affecting her blood in some very unusual ways. But that line of thinking was about to change as I dipped the pipette into the sample and begun drawing up the plasma. The thin black tendrils suddenly combined together and flowed up into the pipette. Thinking the suction had caught the cells, I tried to quickly retract it to preserve at least some of the clean plasma that was left. But as I lifted the pipette, the whole blood vial lifted up with it, In the brief seconds that followed, as I was wondering how this was possible, I saw something that has made me question my sanity. I swear I saw the black mass of blood cells start to climb up the pipette. Not up the center where suction could pull them, but up the outside of it. I'm slightly ashamed to say I panicked and dropped the vial, along with the impossibly attached pipette, down to the spotlessly clean lab floor. The plasma and blood cells splashed across the tiles, but luckily the glass vial didn't break. I stepped back instinctively and watched the spattered mess for movement. There was none. The chunks of blood cells sat completely immobile. I quickly took a glass stirrer from the cabinet, crouched down, and slowly approached the congealed blobs of tar-like blood with the rod. Just as it was about to make contact with the blood, the lab phone rang loudly. I almost dropped from a heart attack right there. I jumped up and grabbed the phone while still keeping an eye on the spilled sample, not quite willing to look away from it should it move as I look away. It was the doctor who runs the study these samples belong to. We shall call him Dr. West. "Hi, is that Mike?" he asked in his usual cheery and slightly posh voice. "Yes," I replied, my voice shaky from what had just happened. "It's Dr. West. Just letting you know you don't need to process Mrs. J's samples. I'll be in to pick them up shortly." "Nah, no problem," I said, panicking both due to what just happened, and also since I had already touched them, but also slightly relieved I wouldn't have to deal with the rest. Thinking quickly, I added, I think one of the vials was faulty. It had cracked, and I had to dispose of it." He paused for longer than I would have liked, and then asked, "So there are still 6 samples left?" "Yes," I nervously stammered. He paused again and then said, "That should be okay. Thank you." The pleasant tone all but gone from his voice now, and followed by the click of him hanging up. The sample still lay spread across the floor. Strangely, the cells looked more red than before now, almost normal. I put on a couple of extra pairs of gloves and set about cleaning it up with disinfectant spray and enough paper towels to be sure the spillage would not come anywhere near to contact with my triple-gloved hands. About 10 minutes later, Dr. West came in to take the samples. I watched him leave and enter a clinic room along with Mrs. J and her still pale and scared-looking family. I processed the rest of the day's samples without issue and as quickly as possible. I wanted to get out of there and home as soon as I could. Either I was going crazy and should get home to rest, or I really had seen what I thought I saw, in which case I wanted to be as far away from here as possible. On my way out of the building, I bumped into my fellow lab tech. Let's call her Carol. I told her all my samples were done, and hers were in the fridge, and I was leaving. She said goodbye, but I was out even before the words had finished leaving her mouth. I was so glad to be going, but the day had one more dose of strangeness. As I was leaving the unit, I saw Mrs. J and her family leaving the clinic room. They were all smiling now, that same empty smile. I spent yesterday relaxing at home. I called my friend Rachel and told her what happened. Between discussing it with her and taking a little time out, I had almost convinced myself I had imagined the whole thing. Almost. Despite the sunny weather and quiet roads, I was deeply on edge when I arrived at work this morning. The image of that sickly black blood moving autonomously, combined with the creepy, empty smiles of the family, would not leave my mind. My skin crawled just at the thought of it. I did my best to avoid everyone when I arrived, and got set up in my blood room without speaking to anyone on the unit. The first few patients came through with no issues. This combined with my friend's reassurances that I had probably just imagined the whole thing was beginning to alleviate my creeping unease. But this was not to last. A male patient who has attended every week for the last few months came in. I could tell immediately that something was very wrong. He was only my age, 40, and had always remained fairly healthy throughout his treatment. He had attended on Saturday when all this began, and looked fine then. Today, however, he looked 10 years older and 10 stone lighter. His face was gaunt and pale. Purple bags hung beneath his tired, bloodshot eyes, and his dark brown hair had begun graying significantly. I asked him with concern if he was okay, and he said he had no idea what had happened. He had no memory of the time following his treatment on Saturday, just that he had woken up at home on Sunday morning like this. I wheeled in a blood pressure machine from the corridor, hooked his shaky hand up to the oxygen sensor, and attached the cuff to his arm. His blood pressure and oxygen levels were worryingly low. I drew his blood and took extra for type matching, should he require a transfusion. It looked very pink, implying he may have some form of anemia. Since my blood room is slightly removed from the unit, I called to a passing porter and asked him to take him down in a wheelchair. I wrote down his blood pressure and oxygen levels and told him to pass these to the nurse when he got down there. This had me concerned. Our patients can often decline quickly, but I had never seen such a drastic change in only a day or two, especially in a patient whose prognosis was overall good. I had little time to dwell on this as more patients were queuing for their blood to be taken. After a few more standard visits, Mrs. J and her family arrived. My heart began pounding instinctively when I saw them approaching. They still bore that creepy, constant smile, but in other ways seemed more themselves. They were speaking today. Her husband held her hand as he used to, but something was still off. I was overcome with that uncanny valley feeling you get when something is so close to real, but not quite there. It was almost like a group of actors playing parts, or like they were learning to imitate normal behavior more closely, but not yet perfectly. I talked with them cautiously, making conversation about the weather, asking about their journey, etc. Mrs. J was doing most of the answering, but some of the things she said caused that base instinct to flare up again. "We can't wait to get to the unit for our treatment," was the first thing she said that rang very odd to me. People obviously want their treatment, but no one ever says that of cancer treatment. It's something people endure, not something they enjoy. Not to mention that she was the only one being treated, and she had referred to it as our treatment. I didn't pass comment and just smiled and nodded. I took an extra vial of her blood without her realizing. If I discover something is going on, and I'm not just going crazy, I wanted some physical evidence of it. As she got up from the chair and was about to leave, she said the second thing that set my nerves on edge. Taking me by the hand, she looked into my eyes while smiling that empty smile and said, "We will be whole soon," patted me on the hand, and left the room. It took a moment for the strangeness of what she had said to register, as I was still processing something else. When she looked me in the eye, I could swear I saw a writhing movement in the blackness of her pupils, like a ball of tar-covered worms, sickeningly curling around themselves. A few more patients had already passed through when Carol, the other lab tech, entered the room and smilingly asked for Mrs. J's blood samples. Now Carol is great. We have always got on well. But Smiley is one thing she is not. She's an Irish girl, a few years younger than me, and has the dry, acerbic, and sarcastic sense of humor that the Irish often possess, combined with the stereotypical red hair and pale, freckled skin. The thing is, even when she is spouting the most hilarious and witty of remarks, she always remains totally deadpan. Today, She was smiling as I passed her the samples from the small fridge in my blood room, leaving the sample I had secretly taken in there, of course. I asked her, "Everything okay?" as nonchalantly as possible. She looked at me with empty eyes and a smiling grin. "Everything will be okay soon," she said, and left the room. Since no more patients were waiting, I decided to follow Carol at a distance to see if I could discover what she was doing with the samples. I expected her to go to the lab, but she headed into one of the clinic rooms instead, followed by Dr. West and 4 of the nurses from his team. As I passed through the corridor, I looked around, my mind racing with paranoia of who was part of whatever was happening here and who wasn't. I had no idea who I could trust, or indeed if I could trust anyone. I waited a few moments and decided to see what the group was doing in the clinic room. I grabbed a random file from the reception desk and walked to the clinic room door. My somewhat hastily hatched plan was to pretend I had simply walked into the wrong clinic room. It happens all the time. As I approached, I could hear what sounded like a strange, low, rhythmical humming coming from inside. I took a deep breath and walked in while looking down at the file. I then glanced up and tried to take in the scene quickly, then backed out again, saying as calmly as I could, "Sorry, wrong room." How I managed to keep my voice from shaking as I spoke, I have no idea. I don't know what I was expecting, but I wasn't expecting what I saw. As I entered, the humming stopped. They all turned to look at me in unison, all supporting the creepy smiles. They were standing in a circle in the center of the room, each with an open blood vial in hand, and dark, tar-like stains on their lips. I think they were drinking the blood samples. Following this, I quickly ducked into an empty treatment room and hid in the small bathroom that is adjoined to each of the single-occupant rooms. I needed to send a text message to Rachel, who works at the same hospital but in another department, asking her to meet me at the end of her shift. Rachel is an amazing girl, beautiful, funny, and effortlessly sexy. We had a rather intense thing a while ago. Sadly, it didn't work out, but we stayed close, and she's one of the few people who is always there for me if I need her. Once the message was sent, I took a moment to calm down, holding on to the sink, steadying myself and breathing deeply to slow my racing heart rate. I was just about to leave the small bathroom, and that's when the door to the treatment room swung open. Luckily, I had pulled the door to and left the light off when I had entered the bathroom. I watched through the crack in the door as one of Dr. West's nurses brought a patient in and asked her to lie on the bed. As the patient turned around, the nurse stabbed a syringe into the patient's arm. In the time it took the young, dark-haired lady to spin around in shock, she was already passing out. She fell backwards onto the bed, and the nurse lifted the patient's now completely limp legs up to join the rest of her body. The nurse then climbed up onto the bed, straddling the unconscious woman. A sickening, gurgling noise began to rise from the nurse's throat as her body began to convulse. Then, with one more spasm, thin black tendrils began to force themselves out of the nurse's eyes, mouth, and nose. Searching, reaching, grabbing tentacles of tar-like blackness, stretching further and further out of her facial orifices, gradually combining together to form a larger, sticky, slug-like mass. The newly formed slug writhed around, defying gravity as it stretched out, growing larger as each thin, slimy strand joined the collective. It approached the somnolent woman as the nurse's body hung there like a discarded doll, her head and arms hanging backwards, motionless, save for the occasional twitch. The black slug-like tentacle then moved with sudden lightning speed as it forced itself into the mouth of the patient and began to pulse. I could see the woman becoming drained before my eyes, her cheekbones beginning to protrude, the skin on her arms retracting as this horrifying thing was desiccating the prone patient. I could do nothing but watch and try not to scream as this nightmarish tableau unfolded. The slug tentacle eventually began to retract, splitting once more into strands and pulling back into the nurse's face, her hanging body becoming reanimated as she climbed off the bed, straightened her uniform, wiped her face of the slimy residue, and hooked an IV drip of glistening green liquid up to the patient. Once the nurse had left, I gave it a few moments before quietly leaving my hiding spot. The patient seemed to be starting to fill out again as the green fluid flowed into her arm. I had no idea what to do to help her, or even if there was any way to help her. I'm slightly ashamed to say I just left. I made my way to the back stairs and ran down to the lowest level. The quietest part of the hospital is usually around the morgue area. So I headed there and hid in a mostly unused bathroom until my friend Rachel was due to finish. I called the reception and told them I had to leave due to a family emergency. The longer I could keep them from knowing I knew what was going on, the better. I'd asked Rachel to meet me behind the hospital when she finished. The people on my unit knew what I drove and where I parked, so I didn't want to risk going to my own car and being followed home. I moved a month ago and still haven't got round to putting my new address on the hospital system. Thank God for my laziness. So for now, I think my home is safe. Rachel came back to my house while I tried to explain the bizarre events I had witnessed. I'm sure she thinks I'm insane, but bless her. She knows me and trusts me, and eventually gave me the benefit of the doubt. You've reached the end, but the shadows haven't left you. If this story unsettled you, prove you survived. Like this video, subscribe to Spectral Shadows, and leave a comment with the part that haunted you most. The darkness is always waiting, and so are we. Until next time, don't turn off the lights.